I had to understand, what Arabia was like at this time. I think it's Gulbadan, and then it's Annette, and then I've come along to join the crowd of these fascinating, women. That's the story. Then people begin to tell historians, right? This old lady going on the Hajj and performing this in the interest of the empire and emperor.
Joining me today is Ruby Lal, a leading historian of early modern South Asia and professor at Emory University, who has written extensively about the lives of key women in early Islamic societies, especially during the Mughal Empire in South Asia. And we'll be talking about a new edition of the Humayun-Nama, the extraordinary 16th century memoir written by Gulbadan Begum, the only known prose history authored by a Mughal royal woman in a way, and the pioneering English translation by Annette Beveridge, which has been published by Juggernaut. Ruby, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Right. So the first question, Ruby, is about, let's begin with Gulbadan Begum herself. So she was writing from inside the Mughal family. She was the daughter of Babur, sister of Humayun, and the aunt of Emperor Akbar. So when you read the Humayun-Nama, what struck you most about the way she remembers family conflict, the affection in the family, compared to the official chronicles of the Mughal court?
Yeah, so my relationship with Gulbadan Banu Begum's Ahwale Humayun Badshah is a very, very long standing relationship spanning over 2 decades. Basically, I began my career as a Mughal historian thanks to this chronicle, this prose chronicle. I was in graduate school doing an MPhil in Delhi University, and thinking about the Mughal world, I'd been fascinated by it for a very long period of time. And of course, like many students, I read stupendous works on, agrarian history, on political economy, on the empire court, very much centered around male figures. And it felt, half history to say the least. But it really, I was thinking how to really think about history in all its manifestations and fullness. And so I got a scholarship to go to Oxford, but on the grounds that I had been, walking in Old Delhi and chanced upon Annette Beveridge's translation of the Ahwale Humayun Badshah. And that's really how I met Gulbadan. But of course, later on, when I was in England, I consulted Oriental 166. That's how our book is classified in the British Library. Even with Annette Beveridge's translation, I'd been very struck by the detail that was very much part of the life and ethics in movement, intended living in the great sort of. We use the word agency. I'm not very fond of it, but the sort of expressions of autonomies that women and everybody else around enjoyed, negotiated, thought through. So her book, especially in Persian, was fascinating because it was about the making of the empire rather than this, imagination of a fully formed, gloriously established empire with diamonds and thrones and what have you. So it was a fascinating read to think how people lived in the early modern world before the nation states were formed. How they moved, movement and migration, not simply because of the physicality of movement, that too, and its challenges, but really, what was embodied in the ethics of movement. I think these were details that I was very struck by. But of course, before the Humayun-Nama, this is a companion volume to Vagabond Princess. I did a whole biography of Gulbadan Banu Begum because I, wanted to think what this life in movement has been like. So, as I said, it's a very long-standing relationship, and it's a relationship in which I've evolved in my understanding of not only this figure but of history as a whole.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very fascinating, this bit that you have described. And you brought up this Vagabond Princess, and this was a very fascinating read to me, because there was so much of information about her that's you generally did not know about. So, and you also sort of reconstruct her pilgrimage to Arabia for Hajj. So why did that journey sort of become so politically sensitive that even the Ottoman Sultan Murad III, they issued orders asking for the Mughal women to be sent back? I mean, it
Yeah.
must have been very daring for her at a time like that to do something.
Yes. Yes, and I think again with Gulbadan, the extraordinary thing I must say, the backdrop to this is really quite central, which is that she is an itinerant princess through much of her life, and in her elderly years, I mean, in her 50s, Akbar establishes the haram for the first time outside Fatehpur Sikri. And of course, it's part of the project of the establishment and grandeur of the empire. And women like Gulbadan are then expected to live as these elevated, respected women who are not to be seen by the ordinary people. And this is the context of actually the pilgrimage to Arabia. And of course, she's very dedicated to the idea of going on the Hajj. People did that all the time in those days, but it is exceptional because she leads the Hajj, and she leads a cluster of women on the Hajj. And the interesting thing again is that she stays in Arabia for over 4 years, right? So I began to think, what was why would she stay for 4 years in Arabia? And that led me to really make this transition, as far as the archives were concerned, from Mughal history onto the Ottoman archives that were housed in Istanbul and in the National Archives. And that's where the 5 eviction orders against Gulbadan are housed. And that really became the bulk of the story about vagabond princess and her life that I began to chart. And basically, it's all there in that book. But just to sum it up, the main cause for the eviction orders was that Gulbadan and her cohort were distributing. It's very hard to translate this word. It's there in every document that Murad III has. It's called sadaqat. Basically, this is not like the zakat, right?
Not that, yeah.
Yes, this is voluntary giving is not good. Beneficent giving is not good. Basically, I think at the heart of zakat is that in giving, it is not the recipient but the giver that is elevated, right?
Yeah.
And the landscape of Arabia was also really very interesting at this time. Sultan Murad III and his ancestors had established the authority in Mecca and Medina and in the Western Arabian lands approximately 50 years before Gulbadan arrives. And the ground of their establishment was, of course, it was by territorial conquest, but they had to make an argument about why they were the right rulers, right? And the ground of this was really looking after the people of Hijaz. And so the year Gulbadan and the party land was the year of great shortages. Grain had to be brought from Egypt. There were all sorts of political machinations and arrangements within Arabia. The Sharif of Mecca was an amazing authority who the Sultan from Turkey had to deal with. So there was a whole range of things. And into this complex universe walks in, Gulbadan Banu Begum, dispersing sadaqat over 4 years. So literally walking over the footsteps of, and of course, by this distribution of sadaqat and walking over the footsteps of Sultan Murad, she's also animating the authority of Akbar the Great. And we have to remember that the millennial was about to arrive, and every monarch, every Sufi saint, many other people had these aspirations to be declared as the millennial sovereign. So it's a very political moment into which, she gets embroiled. And this is a story we had not heard about. We did not know of, the quest to be outdoors in the middle of all of this is also the quest to be with land. And I had to understand, what Arabia was like at this time, right? The pilgrimage was not what we imagine. Our imaginations actually are rooted in this 19th century, dawning of Ihram and all the rituals. They were entirely of a different order. And I wanted to understand all of these things.
Right. And uh, coming back to the Humayun-Nama, I mean, if you read this, this striking thing, and personally speaking, what struck me most about her writing is how ordinary and sort of intimate it feels. She talks about weddings, rivalries, their journeys, and there's with so much of humor, So how does that sort of personal tone change the way we understand the early Mughal world?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and it's very much at the heart of what I do, right? I think history has been made out to be this kind of dry narration of events, right? And I think what I find very troubling about this dry narration of events is that the figures that are in these events appear as fixed, right? As if they know everything, as if everything has been decided, as if, I think what is at the heart of the making of humankind, of humanity, of human beings, all of those along the spectrum, are, I believe, two things. One is vulnerabilities, and I don't mean weaknesses by it, but how do we encounter complications and how do we encounter difficult situations in life, right? And this includes royalty. This includes people around them. So one is this issue of, vulnerability, which is very much at the heart of the project of history, but also the process, right? What are the negotiations that go into wars, right? Is it just kings that are taking all the decisions? So what Gulbadan does is, gives you these formidable, I think, glimpses into these caravans that are moving, the arguments that, the matriarchs are having with kings, or the wives and husbands are having. So having children, for instance, right? It's not as if, it's not a bourgeois conception of our children. It's very much embroiled in the project of the survival of the empire. So I think all of these things are implicated in history, right? And I'm not just talking about royalty, right? Here, I'm talking about, to me, what historians will call context, right? Backdrop. So caravan is a backdrop, and the environment is a backdrop, animals. All these things are contiguous in history. So what kind of history are we writing? I think she challenged me to think this through. And so the project of history for me is a fluid, is a contested ground with feeling. How do we, which is at once, of course, it's been the most formidable gift that feminist work and feminist philosophy gave, which is to center feeling, right? Which was hitherto not imagined to be the grounds of history. So how do we make that a ground of history?
That's a very interesting point you made, actually, Ruby. And another aspect of it is the fact that this conception of Mughal harem, and that's something that you have reached against the idea, against the date, and written also extensively. That we in the public imagination, the Mughal harem was a sort of very closed, very secluded space. But but here was a woman who actually had such a life and such an experience, and but that suggests something that there was much more, that her life was much more mobile. She was more politically engaged. So if we look at her story, what does it actually tell about us? The real lives and influence of the Mughal royal women.
I think at the heart of all of these questions that I deal with is, I believe, the question of freedom, right? I said earlier on, I don't like the word agency because it has all these ideas implied in it that, kind of break the walls, break the harem, and get out and do all these things. I mean, I think freedom is a very complicated issue to think through. I mean, certainly freedom not in the modern sense, right? But I think it's a very robust word in English that we can work with, right? And so for Gulbadan, for instance, the word that kept on coming up in Murad's orders, eviction orders, was mujawir, right? So who were mujawiran in Arabia? I did this whole, these are people, men and women, travelers who are traveling not just to perform the Hajj.
Right.
They're doing that. They're also going to places to admire art, architecture, being on the road. So, what is the sense of freedom of a person, right? You can be within the haram. After all, Gulbadan Banu Begum comes back to the haram from where? She
Right.
begins another journey. It is after coming back that she writes the Humayun-Nama, as we call it, but the Ehwal-e Humayun Badsha, right?
Right. Right.
And it breaks off on folio 83. I have absolutely, this is, since the 19th century, experts and others have been saying that there is no question that she had continued writing more. So what happened to that book, right? That's another story. So freedom in the ways in which she will keep her personhood, I guess how does she historically and today keep her personhood, right? You can be within walls, but your mind and your heart are not incarcerated. I think that's the complexity I want to bring to this idea of history in some ways, to women figures, to those around them, to, we are jumping steps here, but
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
point capturing of Mumtaz Mahal, uh,
Hmm.
right? She died birthing 14 children. I'm actually writing a new narrative history of the Taj Mahal.
Oh, wow, that would be amazing.
Who is this person, right? Who are we talking about? This is a woman who was on the move all the time with Shah Jahan. She dies on the move in Burhanpur while he was on a military campaign in 1631, right? She lived in the outdoors. Noor Jahan, who I've written about, was her aunt. And Noor Jahan spent much of her life on the road with Jahangir, one of the most mobile couple they were, right? And I believe that leads to her co-sovereignty, as I've argued in Empress. So I think there's a different projection here. I think we have to suspend this sense of judgment that one has with modernity, and we think everything wonderful is happening in modern times. So it's a linear way of looking at history, which some I'm kind of hesitant to accept.
Right. Ruby, the history of how Humayun-Nama came to be translated into English by Susannah Beveridge is itself very fascinating. And, I was reading with great interest what you have written in the introduction, and particularly this bit about how she came to learn Persian after the death of her children, and to overcome that grief. And then she got totally subsumed by this passion. And then obviously, so could you talk a little bit about that as well? The story of Susannah Beveridge, and and what had her sort of intellectual journey that led
Yeah.
her to this Mughal princess across centuries.
Yeah, well, Annette Beveridge is, of course, most famous for her translation of Babur's Babur-Nama, and I think it's
Right.
still, to my mind, till this day, there are other translations, but it remains, I think, the most formidable translation. And also, her notations in it are almost like a second book. But she began her journey in translation from Persian into English with Gulbadan's book, which her husband and companion in India, for 20 years, they lived in India. I mean, that's where she met him in 1872 when she arrives in India. And she arrives in India because she was very fascinated by Keshav Chandra Sen and the reform movement that had been going on in India. She was drawn. I mean, she wanted to establish a school in Bengal. So all of this I've charted out, and that's where she meets Henry Beveridge. And it's a highly kind of literary, very interesting household. They are polar opposites in their intellectual views. She too has these conflicted sympathies with India, but he is very much, his positions are very strongly against the Raj in some senses, and that leads to, not his development and so on. So all that, stories there. So Gulbadan's translation, the struggles, when I looked at her papers, I mean, that's how I came to, the Ahwal-e Humayun Badshah. That was the chance encounter. But when I consulted her papers in the British Library, these are voluminous papers, the Beveridge's papers. What I was really interested to do in this reissuing of the Humayun-Nama was to really think about the literary life of this figure. You see, I think this is what gets taken out from women scholars, women thinkers, women translators, women writers, women historians, right? They get clubbed into these little boxes. And it's a very male position. Oh, she's a translation. Oh, she's a translator. She's a writer of women's history. Well, she's a woman translator. She's a woman historian, right? So all these kind of dismissals and erasures. So I really wanted to think about her literary life, and it's a form, and wanting to think about her literary life, establishing her immense contribution, right? And also, I think her translation, the struggles she had in publication of this, she was in her own time dealing with the male world, right? So it's a fascinating story across generations in some ways of people struggling to keep, histories alive. And I think this idea, we were talking about this earlier on, that we were given the inheritance, and I think it's male inheritance to them and what they want to part, is that there are these kind of fixed ideas about history. You have the archive, you go do these formidable things, and there's no feeling in it. And also it should be state sponsored. Well, I think the ways in which documents come to us have really quite a fascinating story. And my editor here in America wanted me to write, she wanted me to do a new translation. And I said to her, let's reprint this with a full story about Annette Beveridge and her contribution. So really, I mean, I think it's Gulbadan, and then it's Annette, and then I've come along to join the crowd of these fascinating, women.
Indeed, yeah. Very interesting. Another question that I was curious about, and I thought I should ask you, is this: what do you think would have prompted Akbar to ask Gulbadan to write this Humayun?
Well, her standing, her experience. If you imagine, this is one woman who has encountered. She was 3 years old when her father, defeats Ibrahim Lodi of Delhi and begins the early territorial acquisitions in North India. And she's the first girl to come to North India at age 6. So she's witnessing this, grandeur that's unfolding along the river Yamuna, right? And then Humayun's reign, the exile, her going back to Kabul in Afghanistan, and then coming back again. So this kind of back and forth, this movement and migration, this unfolding of the empire from, a fully tented to life to Bala Hisar, which is a mud citadel in Afghanistan, to the building of, all the gardens that come along, and finally, Fatehpur Sikri to the fort in Lahore. I mean, you cannot have a better witness, right? So I think that is this is and without question, I mean, this is a curious witness. This is not just some other witness. It's really interesting. Akbar has a extraordinary, very fond, very deep relationship with Hamida Banu Begum, who's also an extraordinary character. He does not ask her to record, her observations, but Gulbadan, and of course Gulbadan, she says in the memoir at several points, as Hamida says, as Hamida Banu says. So there's all this exchange that's going on, and I think these are the reasons why her nephew would ask her to write.
Right. And there are, in the original script of the Humayun-Nama, there are sort of many ends that sort of that seem very abrupt in a way. You have written that somewhere the sentences are ending in the middle somewhere. So, as a historian, if you look at some of these silences, maybe, or some of these, how do I describe it? Maybe perhaps some knots that are not tangled, knots that are tangled. How do you sort of untangle them? And do you see it also as a loss, or something that also invites perhaps new ways of interpreting the past?
So I see it as the latter. To me, a break, ellipsis, non-end is an invitation, and that's really where Vagabond Princess came in, because the Ahwale Humayun Badshah, as it is kept in the British Library, actually breaks off mid-sentence on folio 83.
Yeah.
And that's the connection I have tried to draw, to ponder, to think. What would she have written? And not just, I mean, of course, there's a lot of historical imagination, but it is not just, it is historical imagination. It's not fictional imagination. It is based upon what comes before. What is she embodying? What is there? What are the political configurations around this void? Which is why the majority of the book is in Arabia, right? What's happening in Arabia? Why don't we hear about this in the Mughal documents, right? Not only in her book, which breaks off, but also in the Akbar-Nama. There are very sanitized pictures that are drawn of her Hajj, right? Like this elderly, and that's the story then people begin to tell, historians, right? This old lady going on the Hajj and performing this in the interest of the empire and emperor. Well, my understanding of a person is this very vivacious, extremely agile. She's a woman of letters. And that's what you want to. The only woman who writes a prose chronicle, right? Not only in the Mughal Empire, but across the board. Women wrote poetry, right? So you have to think these are historical issues that I'm talking about. So it certainly is a fantastic invitation.
Also, it's a bit. I'm not sure if I should be asking this, but one question that let me ask you anyway, and that is about your perspective as a woman historian. I mean, even though I don't want to make it sound like a gendered this thing, and or bracketing into gender or thing. But one question that I wanted to ask you about is that you, as a woman historian, perhaps looking at these women figures, would that be? Is it different than, say, perhaps male historians looking at these women?
I think that's an appropriate question. I think I come into this inheritance of feminist ways of thinking and particularly the encounter with the archive, right? There's a couple of things I'll say about that, and that is very specific to feminist thinking, which is this issue of feeling that you were talking about, right? How does one, how do we conceptualize feeling, right? What is the place of relationships, right? How are these with feeling being articulated, right? How will you think about this? How will you write about this? There's this issue of feeling. There's the I have a formulation about this that I've come to understand in my own practice, and I wrote about this in a piece that I wrote for the Time magazine when Vagabond Princess came out. Um, I say to myself, look where you habitually won't look. That is in the textual traditions. So there are, if your practice is to say, oh, this is insignificant, it doesn't, as the male formulation is, it doesn't add up to much, then that's where I would go to, right? So I mean, there's tons of ways to talk about this. There's so many, paintings, for instance. The visual world has been very much at the heart of my public history work. And yes, it's aesthetically appealing, but these are not mere inserts. So I decided over the last decade to actually sit with art historians and began to understand the iconography of art production, not as text, but art, right? What does this tactility mean? What does leaving a signature mean or not leaving a signature mean? How many layers, what are the particular forms, right? So it's about form. I think these are very distinct, not only feminist, but I think starting with feminist ways of thinking. So, I think earlier on labor historians were thinking about the non-elite. So we've gone way further than that, right? It is non-elite, it is the feeling, it is how do you think about every possible documentation with its intricacy, right? Not just add-on, but with its own charge. And then there are issues of forms, right? I feel, for me personally, how do I balance narrating these histories for wider audiences with very dense and deeply committed integrity to the archive, right? These are very, very specific personal choices, but they're grounded in feminist, post-colonial, indigenous rights, kind of work. This is the sort of range, art history. This is where I'll come in, and definitely feminist theory and philosophy.
Right. And as a reader, we are all the more better for it. So, this question about history, Ruby, and you described earlier in this interaction that history is a contested ground, and in contemporary India, and we see that several debates about the Mughal Empire, history writing, historiography, and particularly Mughal Empire that has become very, very politicized. If you could tell us how might a text like Humayun-Nama, which has a very deeply human and sort of cosmopolitan portrait of the early Mughal period, challenge these very, very simplified nationalist narratives about that particular period?
I think Humayun-Nama is, of course, at the heart of what we are talking about, but I believe history is much more multivalent. And I think early modern history, particularly, and Humayun-Nama demonstrates this adequately, right? Early modern history, there's something quite powerful in thinking that time, which is what draws me to it, which is, this is not to say that there were not ferocities of, war, of conquest, of dehumanization, patriarchy, all of those sorts of feudality, rather, all of these kinds of things. But I think that there was more a possibility of shared grounds, right? I'm wanting to call it multitudes, right, more and more.
That's
That we had
beautiful.
multitudes of people, multitudes of leanings, right? This idea that that you're a Hindu, that you're a Christian, that you're a and in boxes and in incarcerated ways, is, I believe, a gift of modern times, right? I think there has been and there must be way more shared grounds. But history in early modern times also is then about the other point I was making earlier on, which is, the thinking of who is a human, who's a woman, who's a eunuch, who's a child, right? How do you live? What is your cosmos? The river, right? I mean, I've been fascinated for so long. River means Yamuna is nourishment. It's a link, right? It's a place of worship. But it's not the other. It's a figure, right? It's a mother. It's all of these kinds of. So we have to conceptualize these things, right? We have these in modernity. We have these very unnatural, to use that extension of feelings, very unnatural categories, right? Nature, right? It's just out there. It has nothing to do with us. It's not
Yeah.
contiguous, right? Why is it not contiguous? And that's the kind of gift of industrialization and development and all of these kinds of things. So I think there is that. I think that feeling, the human condition, right? Its vulnerabilities, and also again, Humayun-Nama will, in relationship to your question, again, I'll say the same thing that I said before, that as we go in modern times, it doesn't automatically mean that everything is progressive and everything is great. In fact, we can see things that are unfolding, right? That it's not automatically so. There are gifts. I think one of the biggest gifts for with all its, again, I would layer it immediately, right? With all its complications, is the gift of the rights of the gift of the language of rights that I think many people have had, and I especially mean people of non-power, right? Historically speaking. So I think these are issues that working with texts like this will make you think necessarily. These are about life, our own life.
Right. And do you think this is also the time when we should also think about how history is written and perhaps the historical figures who are remembered? And is there something about history writing itself that perhaps we need to introspect about?
Yeah, I my feeling is that I think that's been at the heart of thinking in India since the 1980s, right? I mean, there and then the kind of nationalist frame was already being critiqued, right?
Yes.
And so I think there's been all these moves. I think we have to. I feel increasingly that public history must be taken on with a great deal of seriousness. I mean, these are not. I feel this very strongly. I've written about this in one of the debates on this the supposed division between academic and public history for Scroll. I think public history does not mean small tweets of sources that and things. Oh, that is a very beautiful manuscript, or she had this painting, this Mughal woman had this. It's not about that. I think these are very serious things, because I think history is very deeply implicated in production of citizenship, right? How do people who read these works, how will they be as human beings? That's what I was saying, and as citizens, right? So I think there's need for history as a very serious historical enterprise, with great intentionality and understanding that documents, sources, the things we work with, the ways we think, have serious implications.
On that note, Ruby, we had a very fascinating and insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.